Aye, sighed the sailor, looking down on his manly chest. He's gone too. Ate by sharks after. Aye.
He let go of the skin so that the profile resumed the normal expression as before. Need better work, longshoreman once said. What's the double for? Loafer number 2 queried. Eaten alive, a third asked the sailor.
Aye. A Greek he was. As bad as old Antonio, for he left me on me onio.
The face of a streetwalker, glazed and haggard, under a black straw hat, peered askew round the door of the shelter, palpably reconnoitring on her own with the object of bringing more grist to her mill. Mr. Bloom, scarcely knowing which way to look, turned away on the moment, flusterfied, but outwardly calm, and picking up from the table the pink sheet of the Abbey's street organ, which the Jarvey, as such he was, had laid aside, he picked it up and looked at the pink of the paper, though why pink? His reason for so doing was he recognised on the moment round the door the same face he had caught a fleeting glimpse of that afternoon on Ormond Quay, the partially idiotic female, namely of the lane, who knew the lady in the brown costume does be with you, Mrs. B., and begged the chance of his washing. Also, why washing? Which seemed rather vague than not. Your washing. Still, candour compelled him to admit he had washed his wife's undergarments when soiled in Hollis Street, and women would and did too a man's similar garments, initialled with Bewley and Draper's marking ink. Hers were, that is, if they really loved him, that is to say. Love me, love my dirty shirt. Still, just then, being on tenterhooks, he desired the female's room more than her company, so it came as a genuine relief when the keeper made her a rude sign to take herself off. Round the side of the Evening Telegraph, he just caught a fleeting glimpse of her face round the side of the door with a kind of demented, glassy grin, showing that she was not exactly all there. Viewing with evident amusement the group of gazers round Skipper Murphy's nautical chest, and then there was no more of her.
The gunboat, the keeper said.
It beats me, Mr. Bloom confided to Stephen, medically I'm speaking, how a wretched creature like that from the Loch Hospital, reeking with disease, can be barefaced enough to solicit, or how any man in his sober senses, if he values his health in the least. Unfortunate creature. Of course, I suppose some man is ultimately responsible for her condition. Still, no matter what the cause is from...
Stephen had not noticed her and shrugged his shoulders, merely remarking, in this country people sell much more than she ever had and do a roaring trade. Fear not them that sell the body but have not power to buy the soul. She is a bad merchant. She buys dear and sells cheap.
The elder man, though not by any manner of means an old maid or a prude, said it was nothing short of a crying scandal that ought to be put a stop to instanter, to say that women of that stamp, quite apart from any old maidish squeamishness on the subject, a necessary evil, were not licensed and medically inspected by the proper authorities, a thing he could truthfully state he, as a pater familias, was a stalwart advocate of from the very start. Whoever embarked on a policy of that sort, he said, and ventilated the matter thoroughly, would confer a lasting boon on everybody concerned.
You, as a good Catholic, he observed, talking of body and soul, believe in the soul, or do you mean the intelligence, the brain power as such, as distinct from any outside object, the table, let's say, or that cup? I believe in that myself because it has been explained by competent men as the convolutions of the grey matter. Otherwise we'd never have such inventions as X-rays, for instance. Do you?
Thus cornered, Stephen had to make a superhuman effort of memory to try and concentrate and remember before he could say, "They tell me on the best authority it is a simple substance and therefore incorruptible. It would be immortal, I understand, but for the possibility of its annihilation by its first cause, who, from all I can hear, is quite capable of adding that to the number of his other practical jokes, corruptio per se and corruptio per accidens both being excluded by court etiquette."
Mr. Bloom thoroughly acquiesced in the general gist of this, though the mystical finesse involved was a bit out of his sublunary depth. Still, he felt bound to enter a demurrer on the head of simple, promptly rejoining.
Simple? I shouldn't think that's the proper word. Of course, I grant you to concede a point. You do knock across a simple soul once in a blue moon. But what I'm anxious to arrive at is, it's one thing, for instance, to invent those rays Röntgen did, or the telescope like Edison, though I believe it was before his time. Galileo was the man, I mean. The same applies to the laws, for example, of a far-reaching natural phenomena, such as electricity. But it's a horse of quite another colour to say you believe in the existence of a superhuman god.
Oh, that, Stephen expostulated, has been proved conclusively by several of the best-known passages in Holy Writ, apart from circumstantial evidence.
On this knotty point, however, the views of the pair, poles apart as they were, both in schooling and everything else, with the marked difference in their respective ages, clashed.
Has been? I'm not so sure about that. That's a matter for every man's opinion. And without dragging in the sectarian side of the business, I beg to differ with you in toto there. My belief is, to tell you the candid truth, that those bits were genuine forgeries. All of them. Put in by the monks, most probably. Or it's the big question of our national poet over again. Who precisely wrote them, like Hamlet and Bacon? As you who know your Shakespeare infinitely better than I, of course, I needn't tell you. Can't you drink that coffee, by the way? Let me stir it, and take a bit of that bun. It's like one of our skipper's bricks disguised. Still, no man can give what he hasn't got. Try a bit.
Couldn't. Stephen contrived to get out, his mental organs for the moment refusing to dictate further.
Have a shot at it now, he ventured to say of the coffee after being stirred. Still, it's solid food. I'm a stickler for solid food. His one and only reason being not gormandizing in the least. But regular meals are the sine qua non for any kind of proper work, mental or manual. You ought to eat more solid food. You would feel a different man.
Liquids I can eat, but oblige me by taking away that knife. I can't look at the point of it. It reminds me of Roman history.
Mr. Bloom promptly did as suggested and removed the incriminated article, a blunt, horn-handled, ordinary knife with nothing particularly Roman or antique about it to the lay eye, observing that the point was the least conspicuous point about it.
Our mutual friend's stories are like himself, Mr. Bloom, apropos the knives, remarked to his confidante sotto voce. Do you think they're genuine? He can spin those yarns for hours on end, all night long, and lie like old boots. Look at him.
He had been, meantime, taking stock of the individual in front of him, and Sherlock Holmesing him up, ever since he clapped eyes on him. Though a well-preserved man of no little stamina, if a trifle prone to baldness, there was something spurious in the cut of his jib that suggested a jail delivery, and it required no violent stretch of imagination to associate such a weird-looking specimen with the Oakham and Treadmill fraternity. He might even have done for his man, supposing it was his own case, he told, as people often did about others, namely, that he killed him himself, and had served his 4 or 5 good-looking years in durance vile.
Mind you, I'm not saying that it's all pure invention, he resumed. Analogous scenes are occasionally, if not often, met with. Giants, though, that is a far cry you see once in a way. Marcella, the midget queen. In those waxworks in Henry Street, I myself saw some Aztecs, as they call, sitting bow-legged. They couldn't straighten their legs if you paid them, because the muscles here, you see, he proceeded, indicating on his companion the brief outline, the sinews, or whatever you like to call them, behind the right knee, were utterly powerless from sitting that way so long, cramped up, being adored as gods. There's an example again of simple souls.
However, reverting to friend Sinbad and his horrifying adventures, there was nothing intrinsically incompatible about it, he conceded. On the contrary, that stab in the back touch was quite in keeping with those Italianos, though candidly he was none the less free to admit those ice creamers and friars in the fishway, not to mention the chip potato variety and so forth, over there in Little Italy, near the Coombe, were sober, thrifty, hard-working fellows, except perhaps a bit given to pot-hunting, the harmless, necessary animal of the feline persuasion of others at night, so as to have a good old succulent tuck-in with garlic de rigueur off him or her next day, on the quiet, And he added, on the cheap,
Spaniards, for instance, he continued, passionate temperaments like that, impetuous as old Nick, are given to taking the law into their own hands and give you your quietus double quick with those poniards they carry in the abdomen. It comes from the great heat, climate generally. My wife is, so to speak, Spanish, half that is. Point of fact, she could actually claim Spanish nationality if she wanted, having been born in technically Spain, i.e. Gibraltar. She has the Spanish type, quite dark, regular brunette, black. I, for one, certainly believe climate accounts for character. That's why I asked you if you wrote your poetry in Italian.
The temperaments at the door were very passionate about 10 shillings. Roberto ruba roba sua.
Oh, quite so, Mr. Bloom dittoed.
Then, Stephen said, staring and rambling on to himself or some unknown listener somewhere, we have the impetuosity of Dante and the isosceles triangle Miss Portinari he fell in love with, and Leonardo and San Tommaso Mastino.
It's in the blood, Mr. Bloom acceded at once. All are washed in the blood of the sun. Coincidence. I just happened to be in the Kildare Street Museum today, shortly prior to our meeting, if I can so call it, and I was just looking at those antique statues there. The splendid proportions of hips, bosom. You simply don't knock against those kind of women here. An exception here and there. Handsome, yes, pretty in a way you find, but what I'm talking about is the female form. Besides, they have so little taste in dress, most of them, which greatly enhances a woman's natural beauty, no matter what you say. Rumpled stockings. It may be, possibly is a foible of mine, but still, it's a thing I simply hate to see.
Interest, however, was starting to flag somewhat all round, and the others gone on to talking about accidents at sea, ships lost in a fog, collisions with icebergs, all that sort of thing. Ship Ahoy, of course, had his own say to say. He had doubled the Cape a few odd times, and weathered a monsoon, a kind of wind in the China seas. And through all these perils of the deep, there was one thing he declared stood to him, or words to that effect. A pious medal he had that saved him.
At this stage, an incident happened. It having become necessary for him to unfurl a reef, the sailor vacated his seat.
Let me cross your bows, mate, he said to his neighbour, who was just gently dropping off into a peaceful doze.
He made tracks heavily, slowly, with a dumpy sort of gait to the door, stepped heavily down the one step there was out of the shelter, and bore due left. While he was in the act of getting his bearings, Mr. Bloom, who noticed 2 flasks of presumably ship's rum sticking one out of each pocket for the private consumption of his burning interior, saw the sailor produce a bottle, uncork it, and apply its nozzle to his lips, taking a good old delectable swig. The irrepressible Bloom could, by straining, just perceive him gazing up at the piers and the girders of the loop line, rather out of his depth, as of course it was all radically altered since his last visit and greatly improved. Some person or persons invisible directed him to the male urinal erected by the cleansing committee for the purpose. But after a brief space of time, during which silence reigned supreme, the sailor, evidently giving it a wide berth, eased himself close at hand, the noise of his bilge water some little time subsequently splashing on the ground, where it apparently awoke a horse of the cab rank.
All meantime were loudly lamenting the falling off in Irish shipping, coastwise and foreign as well, which was all part and parcel of the same thing. A Palgrave Murphy boat was put off the ways at Alexandra Basin, the only launch that year. Right enough, the harbours were there, only no ships ever called.
There were wrecks and wrecks, the keeper said. What he wanted to ascertain was why that ship ran bang against the only rock in Galway Bay when the Galway harbour scheme was mooted by a Mr. Worthington or some name like that, eh? Ask our captain, he advised him, how much palm oil the British government gave him for that day's work. Captain John Lever of the Lever line. Am I right, skipper? He queried, and the sailor, now returning after his private potation and the rest of his exertions.
That worthy, picking up the scent of the fag end of the song or words, growled in would-be music, but with great vim, some kind of shanty or other in seconds or thirds.
The biscuits was as hard as brass, the beef as salt as Lot's wife's are, so Johnny Lever, oh.
Skin the goat, assuming he was he, evidently with an axe to grind, was airing his grievances in a forcible, feeble philippic anent the natural resources of Ireland, or something of that sort, which he's described in his lengthy dissertation as the richest country bar none on the face of God's earth, far and away superior to England.
You could grow any mortal thing in Irish soil. And there was a Colonel Everard down there in Cavan growing tobacco. Where would you find anywhere the like of Irish bacon? But a day of reckoning, he stated crescendo with no uncertain voice, thoroughly monopolising all the conversation, was in store for mighty England, despite her power of pelf on account of her crimes. There would be a fall, and the greatest fall in history. The Germans and the Japs were going to have their little look in, he affirmed. The Boers were the beginning of the end. Brummagem England was toppling already, and her downfall would be Ireland, her Achilles' heel. Would she explain to them about the vulnerable point of Achilles, the Greek hero, a point his auditors at once seized as he completely gripped their attention by showing the tendon referred to on his boot? His advice to every Irishman was, stay in the land of your birth and work for Ireland and live for Ireland. Ireland, Parnell said, could not spare a single one of her sons.
Silence all round marked the termination of his finale. The impervious navigator heard these lurid tidings undismayed.
Take a bit of doing, boss, retaliated that rough diamond, palpably a bit peeved in response to the foregoing truism. Who's the best troops in the army? The grizzled old veteran irately interrogated. And the best jumpers and racers, and the best admirals and generals we've got. Tell me that.
The Irish for choice, retorted the cabby like Campbell, facial blemishes apart.
That's right, the Irish Catholic peasant. He's the backbone of our empire. You know Jem Mullins?
While allowing him his individual opinions, as every man, the keeper added he cared nothing for any empire, ours or his, and considered no Irishman worthy of his salt that served it.
From inside information extending over a series of years, Mr. Bloom was rather inclined to pooh-pooh the suggestion as egregious balderdash, for pending that consummation devoutly to be, or not to be, wished for, he was fully cognizant of the fact that their neighbours across the channel, unless they were much bigger fools than he took them for, rather concealed their strength than the opposite. Another little interesting point, the amours of whores and chummies, to put it in common parlance, reminded him of Irish soldiers had as often fought for England as against her. More so, in fact, and now why? And as for the lessee or keeper, it was better to give people like that the go-by, unless you were a blithering idiot altogether and refused to have anything to do with them as a golden rule in private life and their felon setting. Yet, though such criminal propensities had never been an inmate of his bosom in any shape or form, personally he would never be a party to any such thing, until it just struck him that Fitz, nicknamed Skin the Goat, merely drove the car for the actual perpetrators of the outrage, and so was not, if he was reliably informed, actually party to the ambush, which, in point of fact, was the plea some legal luminary saved his skin on. He ought to have either died naturally or on the scaffold high, like actresses, always farewell, positively last performance, then come up smiling again. Then, as for the others, he had heard not so long before the same identical lingo as he told Stephen, how he simply but effectually silenced the offender.
He took umbrage at something or other I let slip. He called me a Jew, and in a heated fashion offensively. So I, without deviating from plain facts in the least, told him his God, I mean Christ, was a Jew too, and all his family like me, though in reality I'm not. Oh, that was one for him. A soft answer turns away wrath. He hadn't a word to say for himself, as everyone saw. Am I not right?
Ex quibus, Stephen mumbled in a non-committal accent, their 2 or 4 eyes conversing. Christus, or Bloom his name is, or after all any other, secundum carnem.
Of course, you must look at both sides of the question. It's hard to lay down any hard and fast rules as to right or wrong. But room for improvement all round there certainly is. Though every country, they say, our own distressful included, has the government it deserves. But with a little goodwill all round. It's all very fine to boast of mutual superiority, but what about mutual equality? I resent violence or intolerance in any shape or form. It never reaches anything or stops anything. A revolution comes in on the due instalments plan. It's a patent absurdity on the face of it to hate people because they live round the corner and speak another vernacular, so to speak.
Memorable Bloody Bridge battle and 7 minutes war between Skinner's Alley and Ormond Market.
Yes, Mr. Bloom thoroughly agreed, entirely endorsing the remark. You just took the words out of my mouth. A hocus-pocus of conflicting evidence that candidly you couldn't remotely...
All those wretched quarrels, in his humble opinion, stirring up bad blood, bump of combativeness or gland of some kind, erroneously supposed to be about a punctilio of honour and a flag, were very largely a question of the money question, which was at the back of everything, greed and jealousy, people never knowing when to stop.
They accuse, remarked he audibly. He turned away from the others, who probably, and spoke nearer to, so's the others couldn't, in case they... Jews, he softly imparted in an aside in Stephen's ear, are accused of ruining. Not a vestige of truth in it, I can safely say. History, would you be surprised to learn, proves up to the hilt Spain decayed when the Inquisition hounded the Jews out, and England prospered when Cromwell, an uncommonly able ruffian who in other respects has much to answer for, imported them. Why? They are practical, and are proved to be so. I don't want to indulge in any, because you know the standard works on the subject, orthodox as you are. But in the economic, not touching on religion or domain, the priest spells poverty. Spain again you saw in the war compared with go-ahead America. Turks, it's in the dogma. Because if they didn't believe they'd go straight to heaven when they die, they'd try to live better. At least so I think. That's the juggle on which the PPs raise the wind of false pretences. I'm as good an Irishman as that rude person I told you about at the onset. And I want to see everyone, all creeds and classes pro rata, having a comfortable, tidy-sized income. In no niggard fashion either. Something in the neighbourhood of £300 per annum. That's the vital issue at stake, and it's feasible, and would be provocative of friendlier intercourse between man and man. At least, that's my idea for what it's worth. I call that patriotism. Ubi patria, as we learned a small smattering of in our classical days in Alma Mater. Vitae bene. Where you can live well, the sense is, if you work.
Over his untastable apology for a cup of coffee, listening to this synopsis of things in general, Stephen stared at nothing in particular. He could hear, of course, all kinds of words changing colour, like those crabs about Ringsend in the morning, burrowing quickly into all colours of different sorts of the same sand, where they had a home somewhere beneath, or seemed to. Then he looked up and saw the eyes that said, or didn't say the words the voice he heard said, "If you work." "Count me out," he managed to remark, meaning work.
The eyes were surprised at this observation, because as he, the person who owned them, pro tem, observed, or rather his voice, speaking, did.
All must work, have to, together. I mean, of course, work in the widest possible sense. Also literary labour, not merely for the kudos of the thing. Writing for the newspapers, which is the readiest channel nowadays, that's work too, important work. After all, from the little I know of you, after all the money expended on your education, you're entitled to recoup yourself and command your price. You have every bit as much right to live by your pen in pursuit of your philosophy as the peasant has. What? You both belong to Ireland, the brain and the brawn. Each is equally important.
You suspect that I may be important because I belong to the Faubourg Saint-Patrice, called Ireland for short?
I would go...
I suspect that Ireland must be important because it belongs to me.
What belongs? Queried Mr. Bloom, bending. Fancy he was perhaps under some misapprehension. Excuse me, unfortunately I didn't catch the latter portion. What was it you...
Stephen, patently cross-tempered, repeated and shoved aside his mug of coffee, or whatever you like to call it, none too politely, adding, "We can't change the country, let us change the subject."
At this pertinent suggestion, Mr. Bloom, to change the subject, looked down, but in a quandary, as he couldn't tell exactly what construction to put on "belongs to," which sounded rather a far cry. The rebuke of some kind was clearer than the other part. Needless to say, the fumes of his recent orgy spoke then, with some asperity in a curious, bitter way, foreign to his sober state. Probably the home life to which Mr. Bloom attached the utmost importance had not been all that was needful, or he hadn't been familiarised with the right sort of person. With a touch of fear for the young man beside him, whom he furtively scrutinised with the air of some consternation, remembering he had just come back from Paris, the eyes more especially reminding him forcibly of father and sister. Failing to throw much light on the subject, however, he brought to mind instances of cultured fellows that promised so brilliantly, nipped in the bud of premature decay, and nobody to blame but themselves. There were, on the other hand, others who had forced their way to the top from the lowest rung by the aid of their bootstraps, sheer force of natural genius that, with brains, soar.
For which and further reason he felt it was interest and duty even to wait on and profit by the unlooked-for occasion. Though why he could not exactly tell, being as it was already 7 shillings to the bad, having in fact let himself in for it. Still, to cultivate the acquaintance of someone of no uncommon calibre who could provide food for reflection would amply repay any small intellectual stimulation. As such was, he felt, from time to time, a first-rate tonic for the mind. Added to which was the coincidence of meeting, discussion, dance, row, old salt of the here-today, gone-tomorrow type, night loafers, and the whole galaxy of events, all went to make up a miniature cameo of the world we live in. Suppose he were to pen something out of the common groove, as he fully intended doing, at the rate of 1 guinea per column, my experience, let us say, in a cabman's shelter.
The pink edition, extra sporting, of the Telegraph, Telegraphic Lie, lay, as luck would have it, beside his elbow.
He read about Dignam, R.I.P., which he reflected was anything but a gay send-off. This morning the remains of the late Mr. Patrick Dignam were removed from his residence, number 9 Newbridge Avenue, Sandymount, for interment in Glasnevin. The deceased gentleman was a most popular and genial personality in city life, and his demise after a brief illness came as a great shock to citizens of all classes, by whom he is deeply regretted. The obsequies, at which many friends of the deceased were present, were carried out by Messrs. H.J. O'Neill and Son, 164 North Strand Road. The mourners included Patrick Dignam's son, Bernard Corrigan, brother-in-law, John Henry Menton, solicitor, Martin Cunningham, John Parr, Dora, must be where he called monks the day father about Keys Ad, Thomas Kiernan, Simon Dedalus, Stephen Dedalus B.A., Edward J. Lambert, Cornelius Kelleher, Joseph M.C. Hines, L. Boom, C.P. McCoy, Mackintosh, and several others.
Nettled not a little by L. Boom, as it incorrectly stated, and the line of bitch type, but tickled to death simultaneously by C.P. McCoy and Stephen Dedalus B.A., who were conspicuous, needless to say, by their total absence, to say nothing of Mackintosh. L. Boom pointed out to his companion B.A., engaged in stifling another yawn, half nervousness, not forgetting the usual crop of nonsensical howlers of misprints.
Is that first epistle to the Hebrews in? Text, open thy mouth and put thy foot in it.
It is, really, Mr. Bloom said, though first he fancied he alluded to the Archbishop, till he added about the foot and mouth, with which there could be no possible connection. Overjoyed, he set his mind at rest, and a bit flabbergasted at Miles Crawford's, after all, managing the thing there.
One morning you would open the paper, the cabman affirmed, and read Return of Parnell. He bet them what they liked. A Dublin Fusilier was in that shelter one night and said he saw him in South Africa. Pride it was killed him. He ought to have done away with himself or lay low for a time after committee room number 15 until he was his old self again with no one to point a finger at him. Then they would all to a man have gone down on their marrow bones to him and come back when he had recovered his senses. Dead he wasn't. Simply absconded somewhere. The coffin they brought over was full of stones. He changed his name to DeWitt, the Boer General. He made a mistake to fight the priests.
And so on and so forth. All the same, Bloom was rather surprised at their memories, for in 9 cases out of 10, it was a case of tar barrels, not singly, but in their thousands. Highly unlikely, of course, there was even a shadow of truth in the stones, and even supposing he thought a return highly inadvisable, all things considered. Something evidently riled them in his death, a born leader of men, which undoubtedly he was, and a commanding figure, a 6-footer, or at any rate 5 foot 10 or 11 in his stocking feet, whereas Messrs. So-and-so, who, though there weren't even a patch on the former man, ruled the roost after, their redeeming features were very few and far between. It certainly pointed a moral, the idol with the feet of clay, and then 72 of his trusty henchmen rounding on him with mutual mudslinging. He saw him once on an auspicious occasion when they broke up the type in the Insuppressible, or was it United Ireland? A privilege he keenly appreciated, and in point of fact, handed him his silk hat when it was knocked off, and he said thank you, excited as he undoubtedly was under his frigid expression, notwithstanding the little misadventure mentioned between the cup and the lip. What's bread in the bone? Still, as regards a return, you were a lucky dog if they didn't set the terrier at you directly you got back.
That bitch, that English whore, did for him. She put the first nail in his coffin.
Fine lump of a woman all the same, the side-distant town clerk, Henry Campbell remarked, and plenty of her. I seen her picture in a barber's. Her husband was a captain or an officer.
Oh, he was, and a cotton ball one.
This gratuitous contribution of a humorous character occasioned a fair amount of laughter among his entourage. As regards Bloom, he, without the faintest suspicion of a smile, merely gazed in the direction of the door and reflected upon the historic story which had aroused extraordinary interest at the time, when the facts, to make matters worse, were made public with the usual affectionate letters that passed between them, full of sweet nothings.
The eternal question of the life connubial, needless to say, cropped up. Can real love, supposing there happens to be another chap in the case, exist between married folk? Though it was no concern of theirs absolutely, if he regarded her with affection carried away by a wave of folly. A magnificent specimen of manhood he was, truly, augmented obviously by gifts of a high order, as compared with the other military supernumerary, that is, who was just the usual everyday farewell my gallant captain kind of an individual in the Light Dragoons, the 18th Hussars to be accurate, and inflammable doubtless, the fallen leader, that is, not the other, in his own peculiar way, which she, of course, woman, quickly perceived as highly likely to carve his way to fame, which he almost bid fair to do, till the priests and ministers of the gospel as a whole, his erstwhile staunch adherents, and his beloved evicted tenants, for whom he had done yeoman service in the rural parts of the country, by taking up the cudgels on their behalf in a way that exceeded their most sanguine expectations, very effectively cooked his matrimonial goose, thereby heaping coals of fire on his head, much in the same way as the fabled ass's kick.
However, it was just a well-known case of hot passion, pure and simple, upsetting the apple cart with a vengeance, and just bore out the very thing he was saying, as she also was Spanish, or half so. Types that wouldn't do things by halves, passionate abandon of the South, casting every shred of decency to the winds. Just bears out what I was saying, he with glowing bosom said to Stephen, and if I don't greatly mistake, she was Spanish too.
The King of Spain's daughter, Stephen answered, adding something or other, rather muddled about farewell and adieu to you Spanish onions.
Was she? Bloom ejaculated, surprised, though not astonished by any means. I never heard that rumour. Possibly, especially there it was, as she lived there, so Spain. Carefully avoiding a book in his pocket, Sweets of, which reminded him, by the way, of the Capel Street Library book, Out of Date. He took out his pocketbook and, turning over the various contents rapidly, finally he... "Do you consider, by the way," he said thoughtfully, selecting a faded photo which he laid on the table, "that a Spanish type?"
Stephen, obviously addressed, looked down on the photo showing a large-sized lady with her fleshy charms on evidence in an open fashion, as she was in the full bloom of womanhood, in evening dress cut ostentatiously low for the occasion to give a liberal display of bosom, with more than vision of breasts, her lips parted and some perfect teeth. Standing near, ostensibly with gravity, a piano, on the rest of which was, in old Madrid, a ballad, pretty in its way, which was then all the vogue. Her, the lady's eyes, dark, large, looked at Stephen, about to smile about something to be admired. Lafayette of Westmoreland Street, Dublin's premier photographic artist, being responsible for the aesthetic execution.
"Mrs. Bloom, my wife, the prima donna, Madam Marion Tweedy," Bloom indicated. "Taken a few years since, in or about 96. Very like her then."
Beside the young man, he looked also at the photo of the lady, now his legal wife, who, he intimated, was the accomplished daughter of Major Brian Tweedy, and displayed at an early age remarkable proficiency as a singer, having even made her bow to the public when her years numbered barely sweet 16. As for the face, it was a speaking likeness in expression, but it did not do justice to her figure, which came in for a lot of notice usually, and which did not come out to the best advantage in that get-up. She could without difficulty, he said, have posed for the ensemble, not to dwell on certain opulent curves of the... He dwelt, being a bit of an artist in his spare time, on the female form in general, developmentally, because, as it so happened, no later than that afternoon he had seen those Grecian statues perfectly developed as works of art in the National Museum. Marble could give the original, shoulders back, all the symmetry, all the rest. Yes, Puritanism. It does, though, St. Joseph's Sovereign, whereas no photo could, because it simply wasn't art, in a word.
The spirit moving him, he would much have liked to follow Jack Tar's good example and leave the likeness there for a few minutes to speak for itself on the plea so that the other could drink in the beauty for himself, her stage presence being frankly a treat in itself, which the camera could not at all do justice to. But it was scarcely professional etiquette, so, though it was a warm, pleasant sort of night now, yet wonderfully cool for the season considering, for sunshine after storm, and he did feel a kind of need there and then to follow suit, like a kind of inward voice, and satisfy a possible need by moving emotion. Nevertheless, he sat tight, just viewing the slightly soiled photo, creased by opulent curves, none the worse for the wear, however, and looked away thoughtfully with the intentions of not further increasing the other's possible embarrassment, while gauging her symmetry of heaving embonpoint. In fact, the slight soiling was only an added charm, like the case of linen, slightly soiled. Good as new, much better in fact with the starch out. Suppose she was gone when he... "I looked for the lamp which she told me," came into his head, but merely as a passing fancy of his, because he then recollected the morning-littered bed, etc., and the book about Ruby, with Met Him Pike Hoses sick in it, which must have fell down sufficiently appropriately beside the domestic chamber pot, with apologies to Lindley Murray.
The vicinity of the young man he certainly relished, educated, distingué, and impulsive into the bargain, far and away the pick of the bunch. Though you wouldn't think he had it in him, yet would you?
It was 1,000 pities a young fellow blessed with an allowance of brains, as his neighbour obviously was, should waste his valuable time with profligate women who might present him with a nice dose to last him his lifetime. In the nature of single blessedness, he would one day take unto himself a wife when Miss Wright came on the scene, but in the interim, lady society was a conditio sine qua non, though he had the gravest possible doubts, not that he wanted in the smallest to pump Stephen about Mrs. Ferguson, who was very possibly the particular lodestar who brought him down to Irish Town so early in the morning. as to whether he could find much satisfaction basking in the boy and girl courtship idea, and the company of smirking misses without a penny to their names bi or tri-weekly, with the orthodox preliminary canter of compliment playing and walking out leading up to the fond lover's ways and flowers and chalks.
To think of him, house and homeless, rooked by some landlady worse than any stepmother, was really too bad at his age. The queer suddenly things he popped out with attracted the elder man, who was several years the other's senior, or like his father. But something substantial he certainly ought to eat. Were it only an egg flip made on unadulterated maternal nutriment, or failing that, the homely humpity-dumpty boiled.
At what o'clock did you dine? He questioned of the slim form and tired though unwrinkled face.
Some time yesterday, Stephen said.
Yesterday, exclaimed Bloom, till he remembered it was already tomorrow, Friday. Ah, you mean it's after 12?
The day before yesterday, Stephen said, improving on himself.
Literally astounded at this piece of intelligence, Bloom reflected, though they didn't see eye to eye in everything, a certain analogy there somehow was, as if both their minds were travelling, so to speak, in the one train of thought. At his age, when dabbling in politics, roughly some score of years previously, when he had been a quasi-aspirant to parliamentary honours in the Buckshot Foster days, he too had a sneaking regard for those same ultra-ideas. For instance, when the evicted tenants question, then at its first inception, he, at the outset in principle at all events, was in thorough sympathy with peasant possession, which was one reason he strongly resented the innuendo put upon him in so barefaced a fashion at the gathering of the clans in Barney Kieran, so that he departed from his customary habit to give him, metaphorically, one in the gizzard.
Anyhow, upon weighing up the pros and cons, getting on for one as it was high time to be retiring for the night. The crux was, it was a bit risky to bring him home, as eventualities might possibly ensue, somebody having a temper of her own sometimes, and spoil the hash altogether. As on the night he misguidedly brought home a dog, breed unknown, with a lame paw. Not that the cases were either identical or the reverse, though he had hurt his hand too, to Ontario Terrace, as he very distinctly remembered, having been there, so to speak. On the other hand, it was altogether far and away too late for the Sandymount or the Sandy Cove suggestion, so that he was in some perplexity as to which of the two alternatives. At the same time, he inwardly chuckled over the repartee to the Blood and Nouns champion about his God being a Jew. People could put up with being bitten by a wolf, but what properly riled them was a bite from a sheep. The most vulnerable point, too, of tender Achilles, your God was a Jew, because mostly they appear to imagine he came from Carrick-on-Shannon or somewhere abouts in the county Sligo. I propose our hero eventually suggested, after mature reflection, while prudently pocketing her photograph, as it's rather stuffy here, you just come home with me and talk things over. My diggings are quite close in the vicinity. You can't drink that stuff. Wait, I'll just pay this lot.
The best plan clearly being to clear out, the remainder being plain sailing. He beckoned, while prudently pocketing the photograph, to
Yes.
the keeper of the shanty, who didn't seem to...
Yes, that's the best, he assured Stephen.
All kinds of utopian plans were flashing through his, Bloom's, busy brain. Education, the genuine article, literature, journalism, prize tidbits, up-to-date billing, hydros and concert tours in English watering resorts, packed with theatres, turning money away, duets in Italian with the accent perfectly true to nature, and a quantity of other things. No necessity, of course, to tell the world and his wife from the housetops about it. And a slice of luck. An opening was all he wanted, because he more than suspected he had his father's voice to bank his hopes on, which it was quite on the cards he had, so it would be just as well, by the way, no harm, to trail the conversation in the direction of that particular red herring, just to...
The cabbie read out of the paper he had got hold of that the former Viceroy, Earl Cadogan, had presided at the Cab Drivers Association dinner in London somewhere. Silence with a yawn or two accompanied this thrilling announcement.
Give us a squint at that literature, grandfather, the ancient mariner put in, manifesting some natural impatience.
And welcome, answered the elderly party thus addressed.
The sailor lugged out from a case he had a pair of greenish goggles, which he very slowly hooked over his nose and both ears.
I imagine the Eumaeus, the sympathetic personage like the town clerk, queried.
Why, answered the seafarer with the tartan beard, who seemingly was a bit of a literary cove in his own small way, staring out of sea-green portholes, as you might well describe them as, I use this goggles reading. Sand in the Red Sea on that. One time I could read a book in the dark, manner of speaking. The Arabian Nights Entertainment was my favourite, and red as a rose is she.
To cut a long story short, Bloom, grasping the situation, was the first to rise from his feet, so as not to overstay their welcome, having first and foremost being as good as his word that he would foot the bill for the occasion, taking the wise precaution to unobtrusively motion to mine host as a parting shot, a scarcely perceptible sign when the others were not looking, to the effect that the amount due was forthcoming, making a grand total of 4pence, the amount he deposited unobtrusively in 4 coppers, literally the last of the Mohicans. He having previously spotted on the printed price list, for all who could run to it, opposite him, the unmistakable figures: coffee, 2pence, confectionery, ditto. And honestly well worth twice the money, once in a way, as Weatherup used to remark.
Still going to go for a minute, so if anyone, there's nothing we can do, it actually has to keep running, so if anyone wants to say bye or hi to their family or anything, it's going to be running for another 2 minutes.
Hello, Granny.
Send money.
Hello.
From Toronto, see you.
Hello,
Hello
Dublin.
from Toronto. Hello, Dublin.
Aye.
Send money.
Send a ladder.
You may have noticed we
Sand.
redact